to address this question in the present is not just to address the historical question, it's to actually address a contemporary question around how we value life and one another.
We wanted to create a creative future, but the point was always, after we've confronted the colonial past, what next?
Donc moi, personnellement, je ne vois pas la notion de restitution en termes de retour seulement du matériel.
So yes, we want Nefertiti back, but we also want to give back to the Egyptians their agency to produce knowledge about their past.
This episode, we ask, where are we now? I'll be speaking with a cross-section of experts who have dedicated their lives to studying and safeguarding material heritage and ancestors and reinvigorating intangible culture. They are up against all kinds of infrastructures determined to keep our things in boxes underground, in display cases oceans away, far from their creators and descendants, far from the people whose identities and histories are bound up with them. They work in museums, in academia, they run cultural festivals, they are part of our communities. Each represents networks of communities of practice and care. This is where we are now.
So my name is Ndapewoshali Ndahafa. My surname is Ilunga. I am the director of the Museums Association of Namibia. It's a role I've been in since 2022, but I've been with the institution since 2014.
My name is Lennon Mhishi. I work on a project called Reconnecting Object, Epistemic Plurality and Transformative Practices in and Beyond Museums.
Je suis, comme vous venez de le dire, Dr Martin Donlefack. Je suis historien camerounais des civilisations et des religions.
My name is Hanna, and I'm Egyptian. I was born in Egypt to Egyptian parents. I grew up in Cairo, but my parents come from Middle Egypt, from the hometown of the bust of Nefertiti in Berlin.
I wanted to ask, what is the breadth of what we mean when we talk about Egyptian heritage, both tangible and intangible?
Let me just think of an image that comes to my mind. And I'll think about this image, which is on Friday morning. If you just drive through Cairo, you'll see women going to the cemetery, to the modern cemetery, taking flowers to their dead. Mm-hmm. And you look at the cemetery was built, it's as old as Cairo almost, so it's a 10th century old cemetery that is continuously still being used by the Egyptians. So the Egyptians would go, bring flowers and bury their dead in the cemetery that was built 1,000 years ago. So the Egyptians still use the space, the sacred space for the dead. But the way they also celebrate their dead, by talking to them, by writing letters to the dead, by bringing flowers and offerings, and even sometimes distributing small cakes and biscuits. They call them Rahma Nur, which is exactly the same name in ancient Egyptian. So in this image, you actually see a palimpsest of history. The Egyptians are celebrating their dead like how their ancient Egyptian ancestors would do. They're using this sacred space of the Islamic city of the dead, and they're in the 21st century. So you see how heritage actually collides in this image of just the simple women dressed in black on Friday morning taking the flowers to the dead.
Okay.
And this is just one image.
Yeah.
You see that in tons of things. But the problem is, with Egyptology that started in the 19th century as a white science made in Europe and for Europeans, it never looked at this.
Yeah.
Europe just wanted treasures for their museums. And to house these treasures, there was no space for the anthropology or the sociology of the modern Egyptians.
It's hard to comprehend the millions of Egyptian objects that have been pillaged and scattered around the world. Some in the world's so-called universalist museums, reduced to tourist attractions and signifiers of wealth. Egyptian heritage is still being looted, often with child labor, and sold on the black market today. That's before we begin to address the exoticism and misinformation broadcasted by Hollywood over the years, or the very consequential errors Western Egyptologists have published as scholarship. So I was curious, what is Dr. Hanna most concerned about?
Yes, I think masterpieces and keeping the masterpieces continue, they support this narrative of objects of power. And if we look at, theories about objects and the symbolism that these objects have, we can look at how these objects actually contain this power of Europe that has over the other. And we happen to be this other because, in a way, Europe wants to identify itself that it is different from the other. But then these objects cause a problem that how come the East or Africa actually produces such sophisticated and wonderful art and heritage and history and technology? So in a way to feel par with such advancements that Egypt has is to take it, to actually strip it away. So by this way, the West feels that, okay, but you cannot have it. It's no longer yours. It's ours. It has become of who we are. And you can see this very much in the bust of Nefertiti, where you hear extremely silly comments by the directors of the museum saying, oh, but Nefertiti has become a Berliner. So, really?
When you talk about ancient Egypt, some of it feels like very far from you now.
Yes, this is very colonial. They wanted it to be very far. They wanted it to be completely alien and completely disconnected so they can have it. Because if it belonged to a society, they would have faced a very difficult situation. It's actually the society that can create links with the objects, even by creating new heritage narratives, by engaging with this heritage, by looking meaningfully at their intangible heritage and looking into previous anthropological work done. But even if we have lost our relationship to the objects through modernity, through colonialism, we can create new relationships with heritage because it is part of our innate culture. Maybe we cannot see it immediately, but through engaging with this heritage, we recreate again this bond between the tangible and the intangible.
So restitution in this case would mean actually a leveling.
Yes, I think restitution of the object is not the end result. The point is also restituting the agency to the Egyptians to produce knowledge about their past. Because our past is continuously being written, produced, and reproduced by the West. Very few Egyptian Egyptologists are able to carry out research, to have their own excavations, to have access to their museums and libraries and so on. So yes, we want Nefertiti back, but we also want to give back to the Egyptians their agency to produce knowledge about their past.
Dr. Hanna is running a campaign to bring Nefertiti back home. You can support and learn more about her work via her new book, The Future of Egyptology, available in English and Arabic. She's also super active on social media. Her emphasis on the need for Egypt's Egyptologists to be able to produce knowledge about their past takes on new meaning when followed by our next expert, Dr. Lennon Mhishi. He's from Zimbabwe, was based in the UK when we spoke, and has since moved to Canada. We spoke about his work as part of the larger Reconnecting Objects project that brings together several institutions and globally respected researchers.
I was also intrigued by
your project, Infrastructures of Containment, Museums Beyond and Possibilities into the Future, which you conceived in the context of reconnecting objects. Your work seems to invite different ways of engaging with these belongings, actually touching them, drawing them, bringing them closer to what it might be like to live with them. Can you talk about the project a little bit more and what you're learning from that effort?
Two sort of strands that have been very instructive to how I've encountered the work so far. The one is the attempt to trace some of the historical moments that shape early museumization in a settler colonial context. Rhodesia, in this case, which is now Zimbabwe, but it's Rhodesia, and there's a colony that was established primarily for the purposes of extraction. The early kinds of museumization exhibit that tending towards the extraction, the mining, how to maximize the opportunities for the settler colonialist. So my naming infrastructures of containment in relation to the museum is an attempt to occupy a conceptual space that develops a link between the development of a museum as a cultural, scientific institution which subsidizes the specific kinds of land theft, and in Hari Garuba's words, becomes formative in how we understand African subjectivity. I'm then trying to suggest that the process of museumization happens historically as Africans are getting kettled, contained into reserves, and the particular forms of pastoral regimes that are being developed, and they're being imprisoned, and they're not allowed to walk on the same streets or be in cities or live. So the process of this sort of museum as a modern project is also the process of the dispossession of Africans, in addition to the material culture. So now thinking beyond that, for me, is trying to show how the contemporary landscape mirrors in many ways that specific history, that these forms of carceral regimes, punitive orientations, and how the museum keeps African subjectivities, material and ancestors and knowledge is that sort of form of containment. So to address this question in the present is not just to address the historical question, it's to actually address a contemporary question around how we value life and one another, but also what sort of institutions we want to build and how we want to share space in the world outside the history of extraction, colonial violence. I think that in the case of material culture, especially African belongings, this material was made by people. And because this material was made by people either who were, craftspeople, artisanal, very skilled and knowledgeable people, and some of it had spiritual value, inviting artists and creative thinkers allows us to reclaim a very different kind of spirit. To acknowledge that Africans they're makers. We don't live in a world in which we just consume things made for us, but that we make both material culture, but we also make knowledge.
As an artist, both Monica and Lennon have taught me that I can bring a maker's curiosity to my interactions with heritage, be it material heritage, colonial archive, or human origins research. I needn't think of it as static. I can riff with it, transform it, sample it as one would a piece of music, allow it to teach me a way of knowing, of seeing. What are you taking away from this conversation? Let me know in the comments. Having identified the problematic ways the museum arose in Zimbabwe and other places, Dr. Mhishi goes further to question the necessity and utility of the infrastructure of the museum as it's typically constituted.
There's a very thriving art and cultural life on the African continent in various respects. From the spaces that I've been able to experience, this arts and cultural life does not need the infrastructure of what we call a museum to exist. It exists in spite of what we might call a museum. If we imagine our future primarily in relation to museum, we might limit possibilities. So it's good to think beyond.
Lennon isn't necessarily suggesting that we need to shut every museum down. We may, but more importantly, we may want to examine and transform how they work to the extent that they are still moving as infrastructures of containment. Dr. Mhishi asks, how is the agenda of the museums set in relation to their communities? Who do they consider their primary audience?
How do you center these different communities in the way stories are told in these different institutions? How do we subvert the traditional forms of curatorial authority where the story is told from the position of a very specific person or curator to being told from the position of the communities where this material came from?
It sounds like doing decolonization as a practice rather than as an event or an announcement. And this is also my excited segue into the Museum Association of Namibia, an institution which has been rethinking its concept of the museum and how it could best fit Namibia's context and needs.
What is a museum in Namibian terms?
Our idea and our definition of a museum and a member museum is very, very different or very broad. So we include what you would expect when you talk about a museum. We also have cultural villages, living museums. We have art galleries, we have libraries, we have archives, we have botanical gardens, and we have what we call our human libraries and our human museums, which is human beings, individuals, knowledge keepers. They sign up as individual members, whether they be history teachers or historians or people who are artists or cultural practitioners. Yeah, so we institution of process. I think I'll put it that way. Nothing ever just pops up. And we are an institution that believes that all of our projects should be community driven. Right? So community conceptualized. And what community is means different things to different people. We don't mean a village, which we could also mean, but also the art community, the academic community, whatever.
One of the reasons I wanted to include Ms. Ndapewoshali Ilunga Ndahafa's experience was MAN's 2022 restitution of 23 adornments. This multi-year process began with complex inventory work to map what material from Namibia was in various institutions around the world. Inventories are one of the recommendations of the SAR Savoy report of 2018, commissioned by France under Macron. But it's also where many of our country's efforts have ended, usually with no path to restitution. Together with their broad coalition of stakeholders, MAN designed the project Confronting Colonial Paths, Envisioning Creative Futures, which has seen to the return of the 23 cultural belongings and so much more. For instance, they were able to fulfill a wish long held and shared by their publics to establish a museum of Namibian fashion. At every step, the curation processes include actors from sectors typically outside of heritage to open their work up to more Namibians.
So we got together stakeholders from the fashion fraternity, academics, designers, also people not related to fashion, so like knowledge keepers, cultural professionals, all of these practitioners, artists. And then they did the selections. And we said, how do we create a project that looks at every form of restitution that we can think of at this point? So using the resources and skill sets we had at the time, that is how Confronting Colonial Past was envisioned. Only one component of it is the Museum of Fashion. Before that, there was academic research, there was scholarships for academic research, there was creative design, workshops with fashion designers to inspired by just images of these, the 23 selected. But the point was always, after we've confronted the colonial past, what next?
The other reason I was keen to speak with Ndapewoshali was to better appreciate how, at the institutional level, they seem to have bridged the gap between the material culture they are custodians of, the people who made them, and the purposes for which they were made. That awareness seems alive, present, and fully integrated at every level.
And you ask yourself, who did this belong to? When I'm looking at a fertility doll and I know how they were made, who made them, for whom, who would give them to, if it's your father or your suitor or whatever. Who was the person who this fertility doll was made for? Was it one that was made with, for sale, or did somebody make this for their child as they were going into the process of marriage or initiation, and they would, as a prayer for their child to be able to have healthy children, which is honestly across the world something parents want for their kids.
I've begun to adopt this language from Namibia, this reference to material heritage, not as objects, but as cultural belongings.
So we actually attribute the terminology cultural belongings to Professor Steve Buckridge. Well, he's a Fulbright scholar who was working at the University of Namibia at the time that the 23 returned. He argues that the terminology objects kind of removes that reality of how something was fashioned, how it was, who made it, why they made it. And the fact that in a lot of these collections, the way that they were collected is violent. Restitution goes beyond that in our idea. It's also returning that which cannot be returned physically. So processes, thoughts, ideas, religions, feelings of wholeness, feelings of healing. Healing is a very big focus for us. Whatever healing means to you, and however far, maybe just seeing something from your community, or engaging or researching about something, or creating something based on something that has returned, can provide healing for you on an individual basis, and even where it cannot, where all it brings is more anger.
Our last speaker has made it his literal job to open paths to healing for his people, the Bamendu of Cameroon. Their Tuka mask, the 5th ever made, was taken to France in 1957. Its absence has been a source of rupture over and above the colonial experience. Dr. Martin Donlefack made it his business to understand the Tuka mask and bring the Bamendu people together to begin to heal those ruptures. But let him say something about what the Tuka mask is in the first instance and how it operates in Bamendu society.
Par rapport à sa valeur intrinsèque, le masque Tuka est un masque totémique qui appartient aux confréries qui siègent dans les bois sacrés de la chefferie Bamendu. Le masque Tuka est également un masque rituel. Et il est également le symbole de l'unité du peuple Bamendou. Et le Tukamas constitue avec le Ngimnu. Parce que le Ngimnu est le nom du baptême du festival, mais il est également une danse initiatique. Le Ngimnu et le masque Tuka sont les deux objets qui ont permis de fonder la chefferie Bamendou en créant une sorte de confrérie de personnes secrètes qui ont propulsé la genèse de Bamendou. C'est pour cette raison que je dis que ce sont les deux éléments clés de la genèse.
So we're not talking about a simple sculpture. And I haven't even let Dr. Donlefack fully explain. He has literally written the book on the Tuka mask. I was struck by how he came to this knowledge through inquiry, investigation, curiosity, and a measure of faith.
Je me suis dit, les enseignements que j'ai reçus en histoire et l'expérience que j'ai également dans le même domaine me permettent de croire que chaque peuple a une histoire. Et je ne peux pas croire que la mienne, mon histoire, je veux dire l'histoire de ma communauté ou de mon peuple, soit inexistante. J'ai donc creusé et j'ai essayé de faire parler les objets que je trouve autour de ma communauté. Et un objet particulier m'a fait m'accrocher à ce projet, le masque Tuka. Et quand j'ai creusé autour des notables, autour des dignitaires, sur ce que est le masque, son contenu spirituel, son contenu civilisationnel, son contenu politique, économique et social, j'avoue que j'ai été émerveillé de l'ensemble des renseignements que le masque Tuka me donnait. En réalité, l'influence occidentale a façonné notre analphabétisme concernant notre propre culture. On a des livres qui ont été écrits par nos parents, mais que nous n'arrivons pas à déchiffrer ce que les parents ont écrit parce que certains peuples sont arrivés sous la couverture de la colonisation et nous ont enseigné leur écriture en nous faisant croire que nous n'avons pas d'écriture, alors qu'en réalité, c'est eux qui n'arrivaient pas à comprendre notre écriture.
What have your ancestors handed down that you could take the time to better understand? Martin was appointed director of the Ngimnu Festival. In 2019, they held their first edition. His number one priority then was to make a new Tuka mask and restart the ceremonies that had been silent for 63 years. Then in 2022, the Bamendou were invited to show their new mask in France at Musée du Quai Branly as part of a special exhibition on Cameroon. It was a unique opportunity to have the two masks meet and try to transfer the power of the old mask into the new, the final step to complete the transition from one mask to the next. We've been calling this effort an attempt at spiritual restitution. This isn't to say that the fifth Tuka mask should stay in France, but that the power it holds was a critical thing the Bamendou could address without waiting for physical repatriation. Unfortunately, the transfer was unsuccessful. They're now trying to have the Tuka mask come home so that they can do the transfer there. Despite many problems that have arisen due to the absence of the Tuka mask, Dr. Donlefack reports key changes in the community since they restarted Ngimnu.
Mais je suis émerveillé par le remue-ménage que ce travail a effectué dans la communauté Bamendou. C'est comme si la communauté n'attendait que cet événement ou cette volonté de ressusciter leur passé, passer à table sur des questions de développement et d'épanouissement de la communauté Bamendou. Je suis très content parce que non seulement à côté des revendications liées au retour de nos objets, nous avons pu, à travers ce festival, identifier et restaurer beaucoup d'autres éléments qui étaient en perte de vitesse pour certains et pour d'autres qui étaient complètement en voie de disparition. Ça, c'est une chose. La deuxième chose, c'est que on a réussi à créer, à faire, provoquer un déclic dans la tête des Bamendou pour qu'ils aient désormais une attention particulière sur leur communauté. Ils soient fiers de brandir leur identité en disant « je suis Bamendou ». C'est ce qu'on ne voyait pas avant. Et à côté de cela, les dynamiques économiques et politiques ont considérablement changé. Chacun est désormais fier et content de faire quelque chose pour sa communauté.
There's a lot of work to be done, and in particular, a lot that's possible to do for ourselves here at home. Yes, we must continue to demand the return of our cultural belongings and enable the repair of harm at community levels. Our speakers make clear that recovering cultural belongings is only one piece of the puzzle. Reviving and supporting knowledge and practice may be equally, if not the more vital action. That's where we are now. So far, we've covered a history of theft, a history of demand, a history of excuses. Next time, for our fifth and final episode, we look ahead and ask, where are we going? My name is Ngwatilo Mawiyoo. See you then.